So we have our card wipe project open here, and we're in our first composition, 01 card wipe, by way of introduction. Making sure that our topmost layer is selected, the card front layer, we're going to apply card wipe. Now you can find card wipe in the transition subset of your effects menu, or of course you can just type in card wipe in the effect palette. We're going to choose card wipe, and immediately you'll see something going on here. This plugin was designed with the philosophy that you should definitely see something happen when you apply a plugin, right? So when this plugin is applied, there's something going on the left-hand side here. And what's going on is that this layer is being broken up into little tiny squares. And then those squares are being rotated along their x-axis. And if we look at our controls, all of this will start to make sense. Let me scoot this over just a little bit. The reason that there's anything going on at all on screen right now is that our transition completion slider, which is the first adjustment that we see up here at the top of our palette, is set to 25%. Generally speaking, you would start a card wipe effect with this set to 0 because you would want to use card wipe in general to take one layer and reveal another layer by using the card wipe effect. So you would start at a position of 0. So by dragging that to 0, there's no effect there, and by cranking it all the way to 100, you'll see the cards flip over and reveal another copy of the same layer that we're in. Well, that's because, let me park things in the middle here. By default, the back layer is set to the same layer as the layer to which you applied the card wipe plugin. We want to change that to the card back layer. You would choose in your designs whatever backmost layer you wanted. Now that we've chosen our card back layer, you can see that now as we adjust our transition completion, the blue affected version of our pretty little montage here gets revealed. So basically what card wipe does is it breaks up a layer into a bunch of 3D tiles and then allows you to manipulate the tiles with the controls that you see over here. Simple enough. What may not be evident from the small scale of these current tiles, however, is that this is a fully 3D effect. Let's see how much more 3D it looks if we reduce the number of tiles that we have on screen to actually match the layers that we have. Let me set our transition completion back to 0, and you'll see we have 3 rows, 3 columns. So let's go to our rows and columns values over here and adjust those down. 3 rows, 3 columns. Okay, you won't see anything happen on screen now until we drag our transition completion slider, at which point you can clearly see, aha, now you can kind of get the feel that there's a little more three-dimensionality going on here as these pieces rotate through. So now just to reinforce the fact that this is a 3D effect, there are, in fact, camera controls in here, just like there were in Shatter. We saw that just a second ago. And we can actually position this effect a little more interestingly in 3D space. So we talk about it here. This might make things somewhat more dramatic, and we'll push it back a little bit into Z position so we can see all the pieces here. There we go, and you can very clearly see we've got ourselves a 3D effect here. Let me bump up our card numbers again so that we can talk about a couple of the other features in here. Transition width is kind of self-explanatory once you start to play with it. If we drag that down, you'll see that the grouping of cards in transition from one state to the other gets much smaller. Now, these are all still very regimented. Card wipe is designed, after all, to be a photorealistic effect. So there are an awful lot of tools within this filter designed to make this look more human. And by human, in general, we mean imperfect. An example of that is the timing randomness slider that you see here. If we adjust the timing randomness value up from its default of 0, you'll see the cards begin to lose their order somewhat, and some other cards, the higher we go with that value, start going ahead of time so that we get what looks like a wider zone, but also a more random zone than what we had before. On top of that, you can control whether the cards only flip along the x-axis, which is the default, the x-axis, of course, running right to left on screen, or along the y-axis, which is running up and down on the screen. You can see what that looks like right there. Or, again, random. This will create probably the most realistic effect as cards flip every which way. And you can also choose whether or not you want the flip direction to be positive, negative, or random. Set that to random, and we'll truly start seeing a much more organic-looking effect. Now, just for now, let me adjust my timing randomness back down again to a more predictable width so we can really see the transition area. And let's talk about the flip order. Left to right means the transition occurs from the left-hand side of the screen to the right-hand side of the screen. That's easy enough to see as we drag. You have a lot of other choices in here, right to left, top to bottom, bottom to top left to bottom right, and so on for the diagonals. And then gradient. Well, we introduced the topic of gradient control when we were talking about shatter, and it gets even more powerful here in the card filters. Gradient control allows you to essentially have complete control over the timing of card flipping in card wipe based on the luminance of another layer. For example, we have this gradient twirl layer that you've seen before, and a few other layers down here in the timeline. Let's try choosing those gradient layers as control layers. Let's set our transition completion back to 0 first, and choose as our gradient layer the gradient twirl. And now, if you'll watch the screen as we adjust our transition completion, you'll see that the cards flip now in the order of the luminance values of the control gradient, where the black pixels tell the cards to flip first, and white pixels tell the cards to flip later. We don't have much detail in this number of cards here, so I'm going to crank up the value even higher, something like 18 cards by 18 cards, just long enough to illustrate this effect. You'll see much more clearly now the twirl pattern. Very cool. We have other gradients in here. The quad gradient, which is 4 gray rectangles. Tell the cards to go in 4 different sections. You can check out each one of these gradients and see how they control the cards on screen. I'm going to go ahead and set a couple of keyframes for transition completion just to kind of automate things a little bit. I'll go to 1 second and set a keyframe for 0, jump over to 2 seconds and crank our value up to 100%, and jump out to say about 3 seconds and hit the N key to create a work area that's just 3 seconds long. And you'll see if we generate a quick preview, we've got ourselves a nice little animation. Very nice. Let me turn off our gradient control and go top left to bottom right. And that'll look more like this. Great. And even though we have randomness going in every direction as far as which direction the cards are twirling and what axis the cards are twirling on, we can adjust our timing randomness up a little bit more. We've still got an effect that's not completely realistic. We need to add even more randomness, not just to the turning of the cards, but to the behavior of the cards themselves when they're supposed to be still. Because in reality, if this effect is created, as it was, to simulate a crowd of people holding up cards, well, those people do not hold cards in place perfectly still until it's time to turn them. There's a little bit of jitter involved. So if you look down below the camera controls, here in the effects window, you'll find lighting, you'll find material controls, just like in Shatter or elsewhere in After Effects 3D. But you'll also find a bunch of jitter controls. And these jitter controls are where some of the most creative aspects of this filter come into play. Now, jitter adds randomness to all of these different values. It allows you to jitter the 3D position, that's X, Y, and Z amounts. An amount of 1, by the way, in jitter amount, equals the width of 1 card. So setting that up all the way to 1 would actually probably give us a fairly unrealistic amount of jitter. No one's going to wiggle that badly. So if we wanted to create something fairly realistic, we would set that down to a much smaller value, like say 0.2. And we'll set all of these amounts to 0.2. You can also adjust the jitter speed, but we're not going to bother doing that just yet. You can also jitter the rotation of the cards so that they not only sort of move back and forth up and down, but they also will wobble a little bit. So we can enter rotation values. These are obviously in degrees. Let's say 5 degrees, and we'll tab down a couple and enter 5 more degrees, and tab down a couple more and enter 5 more degrees. And now you can see that in addition to the randomness in the transition of the cards themselves now have a life of their own on screen, which greatly adds to the realism of an effect like this. But jitter by itself is an incredibly powerful creative tool. Let's talk a little bit about how you can just use jitter creatively. Let's set all of these values back down to 0 again. I'll just hit 0, tab, 0, tab, 0. And I missed one, so I need to shift tab back up to that and type in 0. So now I've returned all of our jitter values to nothing. And what we want to do is use our jitter values to create a very chaotic transition. Now you can already do kind of a chaotic or rather disorderly transition if we crank our timing randomness all the way up to its maximum value of 1, which gives us a really wide random value as we transition from top left to bottom right. Or we can also even augment that further by cranking our transition width all the way up to 100%. And with those two values set as high as they can go, you get an absolute random transition from one state to the other. But I want to get even more chaotic than that. I want to get absolutely nutty. And the way to do that is by animating the jitter values. So here we are at about half a second into our composition. And I'm going to set keyframes for jitter. I'm just going to set keyframes for all of these, even though we're not going to affect all of these values. It's just easier to click and drag and set keyframes for everything. And I'll jump a little bit further in, just past 1 second, where the transition is starting. And I'm going to crank our jitter amounts up as high as they'll go. 5 and 5 for X and Y position. I think we can go up much higher than that. For our Z, yep, we can go to a value of 25. And for our X and Y rotation and Z rotation, we can go a full 360 degrees for all of those. I'll jump to just before 2 seconds, and this time I'm going to have to actually hit the U key, and I'm going to physically add keyframes for these properties that I know we need to adjust here. Another couple, and a couple more here. Is that all of them? Yep, that's all of them. And now jump to about a half a second before the effect finishes, and we'll take all of these back down to 0 again, just as we did before. I'll type 0, tab, tab, 0, tab, tab, 0, tab, tab, 0, and so on until we've got our effect returned back to its normal self. And now let's preview this and see just what a mess we've created. And it looks really great. Basically, we break a layer up into confetti, and when it reassembles itself, it's showing us a different layer because we've hidden the transition amidst the chaos of the jitter controls. So as you can see, Card Wipe is an incredibly powerful filter for creating this sort of stuff. And just to show you what a little fine-tuning can do, let's look at this again if we just change the number of cards that we have on screen, once again to match the actual number of squares that we see on screen. That's all I'm going to change, just the number of cards, and look how different this effect looks. It's a completely different kind of effect, equally organic, equally fun, but now instead of a zillion little particles, we've got some bigger cards. So Card Dance, very, very powerful way to manipulate your layers. Let's talk about how to use it as a stylistic filter. In fact, let's talk about how to use it as a cool way to bring on text. Let me close down this composition and open up the next one, Alpha Cards. Double-click on that. And what we have here is a slightly unusual project. First of all, we've got our background fire blur, which is this really pretty fractal background. We'll show you how to generate later. And beneath that, hidden, where we never actually need to physically see them, are a T3V text layer, which is Total Training TV, and a gradient, which is 3 bands, each one slightly lighter than the one above it, each one a slight gradient from one side to the other. We're going to use that to control our text. Now, if we go back and double-click on our text layer, and then invoke our proportional gradient by holding down the Alt key on Windows or the Option key on the Mac and clicking on our Title Save button, we'll see that we have changed our preferences to set up a grid that is 10 units wide and 7 units tall, just to confirm that each letter of Total Training TV can, in fact, fall on a card that exists on a grid. And if I now use Card Wipe with these same dimensions, 10 cards wide and 7 cards tall, and you may have to do a little design work to figure out exactly what these numbers are for your situation, we should be able to use Card Wipe now to bring this text on screen in a very interesting way. Now notice I said bring the text on screen. In everything that we've seen before, you applied Card Wipe to a layer, and that layer became the frontmost layer of the Card Wipe, and then you picked a back layer to go on it. Well, there's no way for you to choose what the frontmost layer is other than by applying Card Wipe to that layer. It's always going to default so that the layer you apply the filter to is the frontmost layer. But what if you don't want any layer to be in front? What if you just want to bring text on? Well, in that case, you're going to have to apply Card Wipe to an invisible layer, or more accurately, to an empty layer. It's important that the visibility be on, of course, because we need to see what's going on. But what we have here actually in the timeline is an empty composition. It is a composition that has absolutely nothing in it. If I Alt double-click on it, it'll open up and there's nothing in here. No source files at all. All we are using this composition for is as a source to hold our Card Wipe effect. And in fact, we've already applied the Card Wipe filter to this layer. I'm going to hit F3 to bring up our effects controls for this layer. If we turn on our Card Wipe effect, and for our backmost layer, we choose our T3V text, and have our rows and columns set to the same number of rows and columns that we designed the text for. That was 7 rows and 10 columns. Remember, we just confirmed that. And let's set our flip axis to be random, our flip direction to be random, and our flip order, we'll choose a gradient, and the gradient layer that we'll choose is the T3V text bands. And now let's take a look at what happens as our total training TV comes on screen. Isn't that nice? So as you can see, with a little bit of forethought, we can create some really nice design effects using card wipe that don't look like stadium cards at all. In fact, if you want to take this to an even greater extreme, take a quick look into the Xena card wipe shots folder that we have here and follow along. What we have here is some samples of an effect created by the folks over at Flat Earth for Xena Warrior Princess, syndicated on television. And what they did in Photoshop is create a grid of soldiers and standards, sort of randomly created on a background in Photoshop, and then use card wipe to break up that grid and add a little bit of jitter to it. See the soldiers jittering there? Then they use the camera controls to rotate that layer back into 3D space, and the transition controls set to a width of 100% to rotate those soldiers back about 50% towards us so that they all appear to be standing upright now on a hill. Again, with some jitter, camera controls rotate around a bit more to give us some perspective, and now move those back into space, and we've got some soldiers standing on the edge of a hill. So let's look at all the pieces that they worked with. They had this background plate of some fields with some clouds going by. They had a big army created in the foreground with card wipe, other armies created further in the background with card wipe, a few more in the background with card wipe, a few more, these moving downhill, created with card wipe, and even some birds flying by. I don't think he used card wipe for those. And the end results, in the final shot, got a really nice composition where the camera pans down. We see milling armies standing on the sides of the hill. Very effective. You'd never think this was created with a filter designed to make stadium wipe transitions, but it was. As I said, this was designed to make stadium wipe transitions, so I'm going to show you very quickly how to do a realistic version of that. We've got a crowd here at a football game, and that crowd is cheering, etc. And the camera has a little bit of shake to it, which we're going to have to compensate for, but that little bit of compensation is going to make this effect look even all that more realistic. Now we've got a foreground layer here, the Go Doug sign. And we're going to want our audience to be holding that sign above their heads, and they're going to flip it over and reveal an image of Doug. So let's select this layer, and let's apply Effect, Card Wipe. And instead of our camera system, the way we've had it before, I'm actually going to use our corner pin camera instead. The corner pin camera will allow us, as we briefly saw in our shatter program, to drag a layer to match the perspective of what we see on screen, and automatically the camera built into the filter will attempt to compensate for the perspective that we're attempting to match. Now, in some cases, you can get a little extra distortion in your cards, which doesn't look really good, and you can occasionally compensate for that by twirling open the corner pin section and choosing auto focal length. And that will very often compensate for any focal length problems that we have. We're also going to set the Doug image as our background image, so as the transition is completed, it will reveal our picture of Doug, the T3V mascot there, the little fuzzy guy. And to make this realistic, we're going to set the flip order from bottom to top. We're going to crank the rows and columns up to something like 12 by 16. See how that looks. That's pretty good. Obviously, we want to randomize our flip axis, and we want to randomize our flip direction, as we have already done before. And let's adjust our timing randomness a little bit as well. So it's looking pretty good. Let's go to 1 second, or about 1.5 seconds actually. Set a keyframe for transition completion. Jump out to about 3 seconds and complete that transition. So that should automatically animate itself now as we drag. And it does. Good. Now we need to add some jitter to make the effect a little more realistic. So we're going to jitter rotation. Let's give ourselves a value of, say, 8 along the X and 10 along the Y and 7 on the Z. And as far as position jitter is concerned, we're going to go, say, 0.2 along X, 0.3 along Y, and 0.5 along Z. Just to mix things up a little bit and give us somewhat less predictable action. We're getting pretty close to a fairly realistic effect. Obviously, you can tweak things like crazy here and get this looking exactly the way you want it to look. But one problem that we obviously have is that this camera footage is handheld, and the background is wiggling around a lot while our T3V logo and our Go Doug sign are not wiggling at all. And a great way to compensate for that is with After Effects Motion Tracker. Now, the Motion Tracker is a production bundle feature. We'll be talking about how that works later on in this series, but for the sake of this lesson, we have actually gone ahead and tracked, with this tracker layer down here, the position of an element on screen. We have, if I turn off the foreground layer, tracked this number 32 that you see up here, and we've applied it to this layer. And by using the parenting controls that we saw a little bit earlier, let me go to my panels and choose Parent, and tell our Go Doug card to parent itself to our tracker, and turn the visibility of our card back on again. Because we went ahead and did that motion tracking work for you, you can now see that the card is nicely tracked to move along with the crowd as the crowd moves, which adds greatly to the realism. We are going for a realistic effect here, so let's take advantage of some more features that we have available to us in our effect. We can adjust the lighting so that instead of a distant source, we have a point source. Let's set that light position in the upper right-hand corner, so now we get a little bit of lighting here on the cards. Let's go down to our material settings and adjust the specular up a bit, not quite that much, just enough to give us a bit of a flare off of our cards as they tumble. That'll add, again, a little bit more to the realism. And to really round things off, let's add a drop shadow. So perspective, drop shadow. I want to be able to see what we're doing here, so let me close down our card wipe effect, and now we can see the drop shadow. We'll set the angle so that it's heading down left, give ourselves a little more distance, and soften that up a smidge. Now let's generate a quick RAM preview and see how we've done. And the answer is we've done pretty well. Looks like we have a crowd of fairly organized people trying to hold these cards above their head. They're wiggling. They turn over and reveal the T3V logo character Doug, our furry TV guy. And these results would be acceptable for, I think, most clients out there. Card Wipe, designed to be a photorealistic card simulator capable of a whole lot more, as you've seen here. Absolutely one of these filters that can just go miles and miles beyond its original spec, and its limits are literally the limits of your imagination.